100 years of caring. The Kitchener-Waterloo Hospital is celebrating its centennial this year. Its history is the history of a community this past century, because it was the people who decided there was a need for a community hospital. In the 1890s, the people here were cautious and conservative, German immigrants and their descendants with a strong sense of Victorian family values, social responsibility, and civic pride. Like many other communities, they saw a hospital as an important statement about their concern for the poor. On a warm June night in 1893, the citizens of Waterloo and Berlin, as Kitchener was known then, met at the high school to talk about a hospital.
There was, in fact, no idea of government grants or government support, capital grants or anything of that kind, so that for a hospital to be built, it needed private subscriptions, donations of money from individuals, both wealthy and not so wealthy. And in that sense, the hospital was seen to be a community project. The community itself was fairly simple in terms of its expectations and the kind of services that it could provide. I like to think of, by the 1890s, we've got regular service between Berlin and Waterloo, trolley service, horse-drawn trolley. Sewers and water mains, street lighting, all those things were in the process of developing as the idea of a hospital developed. So it kind of symbolizes in a way the transition from the early pioneer era to the more modern period. And in a very real way, the existence of a hospital changes and symbolizes the development of the community.
The Victorian sensibility of the time sort of prompted people to donate money towards charities to help people less fortunate than themselves. But because of the nature of medicine, and it was still very primitive at that time, people preferred to receive medical care in their homes where they could feel more comfortable and physicians would come into their home. But of course there were people who couldn't afford to have care in the home, and those are the people who used the hospital. It
was not really designed for the upper classes or the middle classes. It was for the poor. It was to take care of them, to look after them, and in that sense it was a community service. But very quickly it also became a place where the middle and upper classes saw that health benefits could be theirs by going to the hospital. Plans were actually changed to accommodate private rooms in the 1890s, so that as the hospital idea developed, we were right in the midst of it as the notion of who would go to a hospital and whom it would serve was beginning to change.
In 1894, this was an empty patch of land between Berlin and Waterloo. It was isolated, almost rural. Familiar landmarks like Mutual Life hadn't been built yet. The land was owned by Joseph Seagram, and he donated it, all 14 acres, to the hospital trust. It was a generous donation, but there were a few strings attached.
Restrictions that Joseph Seagram put on the title were not without importance for the community. That is, that it was to be open to all, regardless of race, creed, or ethnic origin. In that sense, he was probably 100 years ahead of his time. On the other hand, he also put a restriction on the way that money could be raised or the fact that they couldn't go into debt to expand the hospital. In that sense, maybe that's a representation of his frugal business background.
When the new hospital opened its doors in July of 1895, it was run by a lady superintendent, Jessie Duncan. The Board of Trustees set policy, but she ran the hospital.
She had a multifaceted role. She was not only the administrator, but she was, in a sense, the pharmacist. She would have to order supplies and tend to the dispensary to make sure that the drugs were being provided properly. She educated the nurses. She made sure that the kitchen was working properly, that the food was being produced properly. She had to look after the people who were doing the cooking, and as well as maintenance around the hospital. She had many different roles that she had to step into, as well as working with the physicians who were coming to the hospital. None of the physicians actually worked here on a full-time basis, but rather would come in on a weekly basis. They had a rotation with 12 physicians originally, and each one would work 1 week at a time to tend to the hospital's medical needs.
Kathleen Scott was lady superintendent from 1930 to 1946, efficiently managing the hospital and supervising the education of the nursing students. But the hospital's needs were changing. People like Gordon Freeson, who was appointed administrator in 1946, met the new challenges with a background in medicine and business.
Hospitals are big businesses these days. When you look at the numbers of people that we employ, the vast scope of services and activities that go on within a hospital, and in fact, the amount of money that hospitals spend. This hospital's budget is over $100 million a year, and we employ well over 2,000 people. I have a responsibility to convey the hospital story, if you will, to our community as to what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, so that the community is kept informed and has an opportunity to have some input into the types of services that we provide. Everyone that has a responsibility for seeing that this hospital operates does a superb job and takes that very responsibly. So it's a well-managed hospital in that sense. We're fiscally responsible, and above all else, I think we're really a caring institution.
There was only one full-time nurse, and that was the lady superintendent. All the other nurses were students. This was how the hospital could sort of reduce their costs, by paying a nurse approximately $3 a month when they first started, $5 a month in their third and final year. So patient care often was a small part of their role, because they had to not only sort of look after the patients and make sure that they received their food and care, but also they had to clean the hospital, they had to work in the garden. They had many tasks, and most nurses, once they did graduate, couldn't find jobs working in hospitals. They became private duty nurses, so they would continue to work in Waterloo or Berlin, working in the homes of the citizens who could afford to pay for their services. So
I came in training in this building in 1950, so I had my first year as a student nurse in the old original hospital. It was really an exciting time to be in nursing. For the first time in the history of nursing, we were being educated as opposed to being used as labor.
It was busy. We lived in the residence, came through the tunnel, nipped onto the wards. You had your patient assignment to do, then you ran back to your room, tried to get your homework done, that sort of thing. But it was a close community. You got to know the people very well after living sort of in the same place with them for 3 years.
It's a total immersion as opposed to being in a community college. And again, I'm not convinced it's better at all, because I think that nurses have to be educated as opposed to, I always used to joke and say, you really don't need to give 2,000 bedpans to know how to give a bedpan. Or
30 years ago, you did your nurses training and you learned as you went along on the job, but not too often did people go on for other degrees, other education. It was quite an adventure. I went in '68 and did a postgrad course in neuro nursing at Montreal, and that was sort of unusual, at least certainly for this area.
I think as the treatment modalities began to become more complex, people had to have a much wider knowledge base. Also, as physicians got a lot more, their practice patterns changed. They really had to be able to trust that the nurses knew what they were doing in terms of managing that patient.
Now there's a phenomenal number of nursing staff that are doing continuous education. There's a variety of approaches. They're doing courses that enhance their particular skills for the day-to-day work they're doing.
I think there are several parameters of nursing. There's the administrative component, there's a research component, but there's also the practice component. And I think the practice component is the essential part. It's what we're all about. It's caring for patients. That really never has changed over time. And I think there is a refocus back to patients and patient care. It's a reason for being. It's the purpose of the hospital.
I think one of the things that the history of the hospital has proven is how important the role of women were in the community, and the hospital auxiliary's role in maintaining the hospital and in providing services for it, providing support for it, is really indispensable. We tend to overlook that and think of the men and the builders of the hospital, but not the actual operation of it. Without the women of the community, KW Hospital would not have succeeded.
The ladies' auxiliary during the early years was made up generally of the wives of physicians and prominent citizens in the community, industrialists and merchants, who were actually the people involved with the construction of the hospital and providing the funds. Again, it was a reflection of, I think, Victorian sensibilities. The women got involved in a different way, but just as important, in that they would raise money in the community through various fundraising events, and that money would go towards the purchase of medical equipment or updates to the building itself. The Ladies' Auxiliary purchased the first ambulance for the hospital in 1901. It was a horse-drawn ambulance. I think it was purchased at an expense of about $800.
The auxiliary raises an average of $100,000 a year for the hospital, but that's just part of their contribution. As volunteers, they save the hospital 9 times that amount each year.
We work in chemotherapy, we help in the x-ray department, and portering, which means taking patients down to the x-ray department and making sure that they're looked after, then bringing them back to their beds. And we work in at least 40, yes, around 40 sections of the hospital. Last year, I know I asked our director of volunteers how many hours we did, and we gave 40,000 hours of free care to people. And I think we stopped the intimidation, the feeling that you're frightened when you go into the hospital, you meet a lady in pink or a man in a blue jacket. We have a lot of males now helping us, and it just gives that, you're not just a number in the hospital.
The hospital's philosophy, I believe, is to put the patient or the consumer or families at the center of care. Really, the philosophy is to, I think, emphasize and to support patients to be part of the decision-making about some of the outcomes of their own care, their own treatment.
The old idea of those OR doors opening and families being left outside has changed. So the parents come in here with the children, the people having operations come in here and they sit in a fairly comfortable environment until the anaesthetist or the nurse is ready to take the patient up to the room. It just takes some of that mystique away, that fear of an operating room.
The diagnostic facilities that are now available are infinitely superior to what we used to do years ago, in that they're now mostly non-invasive. In other words, you can do a CAT scan and have a look at what's going on without really having to make a cut or put a needle in or do something of that sort.
We've been able to make birth quite a safe procedure. There are no 100% guarantees that everybody's going to leave with a cute little bundle of joy, but your chances are greatly increased because of the technological advances. And now, when we're looking at working with families, we're starting from an environment of safety, and so now able to say what's going to make this better and make it a nicer, a pleasanter, a more individualized experience.
When I came to the hospital in 1988, the number that was being used at that time was 625 beds in our hospital. My understanding is now we are running about 380 beds, but we are still looking after the same number of patients in our hospital. They're just moving through the hospital a lot faster than they used to.
Way back 100 years ago, surgery was a very precarious procedure. There were tremendous complications. The recovery time for people was sometimes over months. The main change in that is a lot of very complex procedures can now be done on a day-to-day basis, and that again is due to technology. There's a short recovery time period. Patients very often go home on the same day. And the recovery period for some very, very major procedures is quite short.
I've been here 28 years. Pharmacy has moved from more of a manufacturing base when I came, and just dispensing, to a clinical base where a lot of our pharmacists are on the floors, and they are interacting directly with the patients and the other members of the interdisciplinary healthcare team.
I think people are working more towards trying to share their expertise. So if they're a physiotherapist, occupational therapist, nursing, physicians, etc., rather than keeping and hanging on to your own particular knowledge, we're trying to share, now, this is the part that I know really well. How do we do it together? How do we work together really more as a team and try and give the patients as good a care as we can?
Only a few years ago, new babies spent most of their time in nurseries, row after row. Today, well babies stay with their mothers. In the special care nursery, mothers spend time with their babies, and even little brothers and sisters are encouraged to visit.
We found that babies, even sick babies, can be quite resilient, that infections are controlled by simple measures such as hand washing, and by asking people who have communicable diseases or aren't feeling well not to visit, which is common sense, really.
The hospital's pharmacy still makes its own intravenous solutions, but now that includes home intravenous solutions, and that's not just a way to make money.
It's improving patient care tremendously by getting them out of the hospital, institutional scene, back with their families, to a familiar environment. It helps their being and their wellness and their recovery time tremendously.
has been a leader in many areas, one of them architecture. When most hospitals were square or rectangular, the distinctive Y shape of the 1951 addition here was revolutionary. The services were in the core, the patient rooms in the three wings.
There were people who came from all over North America to see it. It was considered the best in terms of a care facility. And it was much easier to give care for the nurses, particularly, because everything was centralized in the core, and then you branched out and cared for your patients down each wing. And you could see all three ways. Immediately when a light would come on asking for service of any kind, you could see from the central core.
A pneumatic tube delivery system was part of that 1951 addition, and it's still in operation today, as efficient as it ever was. Traveling at 22 miles an hour, it delivers everything from memos to samples from one floor to another. But physical innovations are just one part of KW's history. In services, the hospital has been a real leader.
My former boss, Perrin Stacia, was one of the founders of Canadian Society of Hospital Pharmacists, and certainly the institutional father here in pharmacy. Came here in 1946 and developed many unique processes. Before major pharmaceutical houses got into the development of IVs, Mr. Stacia had sterile rooms right back in the same location where production of IVs, intravenous solutions of his own, were done.
The pre-admit clinic, because so many patients are coming in the morning of their surgery, they come anywhere up to 2 weeks ahead of time, and they have the routine blood work done and all those things you sort of have to make sure all's well for the safety of the patient in surgery. But it gives the nursing staff a chance to teach the patient what will be expected when they come in.
Then they have a chance to sort of think about it and see if there are any other questions. We've also been recognized, I think, by the province, or at least by the JPPC, which is a combined organization of hospitals, physicians, and government, as being sort of leaders in the treatment of a variety of conditions for our length of stay in hospital and our results in that regard. And so we're in a number of procedures, we're sort of used as a benchmark hospital as what you should aim for.
I think we were in on the ground floor of introducing midwifery because we have quite an active contingent of midwives. There are 8 registered midwives who work in and around this community. 5 of them currently have privileges in this hospital. The other 3 work a little further out of the community. And yes, we have taken a very proactive way of working with them. Before the legislation legally recognizing them was officially proclaimed by the government, we had a planning committee together with the doctors, with nurses, with consumers, and with administration sitting on it and planning for how could we make this happen.
We have offered, as a community hospital, training programs in virtually every health discipline that you can imagine. We have an affiliation with 2 or 3 universities for training of their students.
Yes, the hospital here is well known throughout the province and actually nationally for a couple of areas. Certainly our crisis intervention program. We have a crisis clinic that operates at the hospital 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Their types of intervention and their approaches to the individuals that present themselves is rather unique, and it really is a leader, certainly in the province in that area.
Oh, when you see something come to fruition and something new is started and it's working and you know, people benefit from it, the staff takes a lot of pride in the quality of the service that they provide, and so it's when you do something new and you get it organized and it really comes together and it really starts to work. I think that's the fun part too, and that's where the satisfaction is.
As the hospital celebrates its centennial, it's celebrating the past and the future. Over the years, its physical appearance has changed dramatically, responding to changes in medical technology and population growth. In 1970, Governor General Roland Michener opened the last major expansion. The hospital is still growing today, but in a very different way.
I think the hospital's philosophy is in transition, very much the same as healthcare is in transition. I think that a lot of what we accepted years ago as being the classical hospital environment and the reason for a hospital existing is now changing.
First of all, I would have to say that the whole attitude, I believe, of the hospital is one of truly a caring attitude. Our staffs at all levels and all positions in the hospital really do care about what they're doing, and they care particularly for the patients that they're serving. They're very proud people.
Our future, we are told, will probably get to a point where we are 80% outpatient ambulatory care rather than a high level of inpatient care, so that all our master plans are focusing on that with the creation of a new ambulatory care mall on the 2nd and 3rd floors.
In 1989, the most significant change happened when the Kitchener-Waterloo Hospital took on all the obstetrical and care of children for the cities of Kitchener-Waterloo and surrounding areas. That meant we went from a facility that had been built for about 2,500 births to, well, we hit 4,600 births in 1991 here, and we're leveling out now around 4,300 births a year. The hospital's still the same size as it was in 1989. What we've had to do is be creative in how we're going to accommodate people and how we're going to soften our approach and be a little more consumer-oriented.
Just last year, we took one wing of one floor and completely redid it into a new dialysis unit. And of course, in a dialysis unit, we had to literally take out all the patient rooms, individual patient rooms, and make it into one large facility, because you have to be able to watch all of the patients that are on dialysis machines at all times. So it's that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to do with almost the entire building.
Running its own printing press to save costs, taking in laundry from other hospitals to make money, creative fundraising. They all help with the bottom line. But as government grants shrink, the hospital will be looking for community support in a Centennial Capital campaign. In a way, it's come full circle from the days when the community got together to build a hospital.
It's been 100 years since the Berlin-Waterloo Hospital admitted its first patient, a century of dramatic changes. Today, KW Hospital is one of the largest and most successful community hospitals in Canada. Through all of this, one thing has remained constant. The hospital has cared for the community, and the community supported the hospital. No matter what the future brings, it's a partnership, a legacy worth celebrating.
Stay with CKCO-TV for Algonquin Stories tonight at 8. The comedy of Something Wilder is next, here on CKCO-TV.